The United Nations, formed after World War II. The United Nations is a unique international organization with over 192 independent countries as members who have joined together to work for world peace, social progress. Founded in 1945, the United Nations was designed to address the big challenges facing our world today, such as poverty, environmental degradation, justice, human rights abuses. Such issues affect everyone around the world, so they're a global issue. The United Nations' primary purposes are firstly to keep peace throughout the world, secondly, to develop friendly relationships among nations, and thirdly, to work together to help poor people live better, to conquer hunger, disease, and illiteracy, and to encourage respect for each other's rights and freedoms. The United Nations operates all around the world. The multidimensional work of the United Nations is channeled through six principal organs and a host of other partnerships with organizations that improve the lives of people in every corner of the earth. The United Nations was established in the aftermath of a devastating world war. World leaders strongly felt the need for an international institution that would help bring world peace and prevent future wars. The idea for an international organization originated in the aftermath of the First World War. That was in 1914 to 1918. So in 1919, right after World War I, the League of Nations was founded to prevent future conflict. But with the start of World War II in 1939, it became clear that the League of Nations had failed to accomplish this objective. The League of Nations was powerless without a military to enforce economic and military sanctions upon countries violating its covenant, its laws. Several powerful countries failed to support the League, leading to its ultimate failure. For instance, the United Nations never joined. Germany was only a member for 7 years. The Soviet Union was a member for only 5 years. Japan and Italy withdrew from the League of Nations in the early 1930s. Governments accustomed to operating independently found it difficult to work in cooperation with other countries. Many countries blamed the League of Nations for not being able to prevent World War II. But without the major superpowers backing the League, it had little influence over international affairs. The Atlantic Charter. In the midst of World War II, when the US and the United Kingdom were fighting the Nazis and their allies, Japan and Italy, US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill met secretly on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That was in 1941. Right, Roosevelt and Churchill signed the document known as the Atlantic Charter. The charter was not a formal agreement between US and Britain, but served as a commitment for the two countries to work together toward world peace. The charter outlined a future organization that revolved around the hopes of world peace. The eighth clause of the Atlantic Charter states, quote, all nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force. Sparked by the Atlantic Charter and subsequent declarations between allied countries, there was a growing interest among nations to work together toward peace. In 1944, right before the end of the war, representatives from China, Britain, Russia, the United States convened in Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. to discuss a possible blueprint for an intergovernmental organization. The United Nations is what would come of that. The organization was to be known as the United Nations and would consist of six main bodies. The first is the General Assembly, composed of all the nation states. All 191 today are the General Assembly. Secondly, the second organ of the United Nations is the Security Council. The third is an International Court of Justice. Fourth, a Secretariat housing the main bodies of the UN. Five, the Economic and Social Council. And finally, the Trusteeship Council. Excuse me. It was clear by February 1945 that Germany would be defeated and World War II would be winding down. Leaders from the US and Britain and Russia met in Yalta, a town located in the Soviet Union, where Ukraine is today, and they discussed the possible scenarios for Europe after World War II. Well, the leaders reached an agreement on voting procedures in the Security Council of the new organization called the United Nations. The countries agreed to reconvene that April in San Francisco. On April 12, 1945, President Roosevelt suddenly died at Warm Springs, Georgia, of cerebral hemorrhage. The vice president, Harry S. Truman, took his place as president. In April 1945, the nations met in San Francisco to create a charter to be approved by all participating nations that would serve as the foundation of the United Nations. 51 nations were invited to San Francisco, representing 80% of the world's population, and this includes the Soviet Union. The Yalta Conference did not resolve the rights of superpowers. The US, Britain, China, Russia, France were the superpowers. So Yalta, they didn't resolve the rights the superpowers would hold in the Security Council, the second organ of the United Nations Security Council. In San Francisco, it was agreed that each of the big five, those superpowers, would have the right to veto. If any one of them were to cast a negative vote, the Security Council would not be able to adopt a resolution. So it just takes one country to stop a whole law from being passed, basically. Today, the five permanent members of the UN Security Council still have veto power. They can void any council resolution, no matter what the pressure from the supporting majority may be. This power is exercised when any permanent member enters a nay vote. On June 25, 1945, delegates from each country met in San Francisco Opera House to approve the charter. Delegates voted yes by standing in show of support of the United Nations. The Opera House broke out into thunderous applause as the charter was declared accepted. The following day, delegates signed the charter amidst a background of flags from 51 different nations. President Truman said, quote, "The Charter of the United Nations, which you have just signed, is a solid structure upon which we can build a better world. History will honor you for it. Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in the most destructive of all wars. You have won victory against war itself. With this charter, the world can begin to look forward to the time when all worthy human beings may be permitted to live decently as free people. If we fail to use it, we shall betray all those who have died in order that we might meet here in freedom and safety to create it. If we seek to use it selfishly for the advantage of any one nation or any small group of nations, we shall be equally guilty of that betrayal. Here's your discussion questions for Google Form.